There were two things that happened recently that particularly sparked or reignited my interest, I guess, in this area. And one was, some of you will have come to our Hogan 25 years event last year, similar time of year actually, but a year ago. And in that we looked at some data analysis, some archive data, and there were some prominent results that came out from the values. And another one was actually earlier this year. There was a Hogan European Distributors event in Prague, and Bob Hogan gave an address there where his focus was very much on values and a lot to do, in fact, with their impact within organizations and their impact on real business outcomes. So those two things kind of combined to reignite my interest in this area. And I think, so some of us here will use all three Hogan instruments, but some may only use HPI and HDS, and some, in fact, may only use HDS. But I think even those of us who do use the MVPI, maybe we sometimes forget just how important values are, how influential they can be, the kind of rich information that we can derive from them and help our clients with. I think values really help to give meaning to many aspects of our lives. They shape many of our choices and our decisions. So this slide then touches on each point that I'm going to address in this session. So for instance, first up, values influence how happy we're going to be in certain environments and how the extent to which we'll fit. So there's a link between what kind of industry sector we might choose to go into, and I'll present some data related to that. Secondly, actually sort of refining that even further then, our values can have an impact on what specific kind of professions we're going to choose to spend our time in. Thirdly, of course, they have a huge impact on the culture of an organisation and culture of different types of organisations. So we're going to have a look at mergers between very different organisations and the impact that actually values conflict had on the relative success, or rather failure, of those mergers. Team impacts, of course, we often talk about the dynamics within teams and the relative success of those teams related to the cohesion or the diversity of values within the team. Interestingly, I hadn't realised this, but a lot of storylines actually are devised from value conflicts, so I'll just touch on that. And also politics. Our values obviously influence our politics, but not perhaps in the specific way you might think. So those are some of the themes that I'm going to cover just to kind of reignite our interest in the whole values field. So starting with some of the data analysis that we did for our 25 years of Hogan event, what we looked at was years and years worth of data across all three Hogan instruments, and then compared various different industry sectors. We did one at just the public sector versus private sector level, and then we did some others where we had more data in specific industries like food and beverage. And when we made those comparisons, we found that the most significant differences, the largest and the most frequent differences, were between the value scales, were between scales on the MVPI, not on the HPI or the HDS. And I guess, you know, everything that I've just said about values shaping our choices and decisions in life feeds into that. It feeds into, so where are we going to fit? Where are we going to choose to work? So if you're doing any analysis, looking at different individual differences between people in different kinds of jobs or in different kinds of industry sectors, it should come as no surprise to find that actually it's your values that tends to differentiate you more than whether you're extrovert or introvert, for instance. And I thought, and some of you will have seen this before, but just to illustrate the point, I've got three examples from three different industry sectors in terms of highest and lowest values. So in banking, the highest was on commerce, and the lowest was on tradition, almost actually equal lowest with security here. So obviously with the commerce, these people in banking, they're in that field, they actually value opportunities to make money, to realise profits, to have their performance perhaps judged against or reflected by financial success. And they're not so constrained by convention, the lower, relatively lower tradition scores. It's still not massively low. I think that's interesting that whilst it's their lowest value, they're not so low as to be complete kind of rule breakers and totally unconventional, but they have that sort of balance of being in the middle. But obviously that high commerce is a real signifier of the choice of career in that industry. And then a second area, food and beverage, which is interesting. We've got this because, of course, Steph, who's going to be talking to us later, works for SSP, which is a food and beverage company. And look at this. I love this. Their highest value is on hedonism. And there are a significant number of people in here actually who work for people, certainly in the alcoholic beverage industry. So, yeah, and you know, it's clear as a bell, isn't it, how high that is. And then their lowest score is on security. So they value opportunities to see pleasure in things, to perhaps lighten things up a little, and also they don't worry so much about having a totally predictable, risk-free kind of job. And then the last one is people working in the healthcare sector, and their highest value is on science, but actually you'll see this profile overall actually has got quite a few high points. So it is the highest one is science, but they are also pretty high on altruism and power as well. So quite an interesting mix there within healthcare. So obviously they value scientific, rational, logical approaches for problem solving or decision making, and like banking, their lowest is tradition, but again, it's kind of in the middle. So it's that sort of balance between not being too constrained by what's gone before, but also perhaps having some respect for what's gone before. Okay, so those are some examples of how, sorry?
Just a quick question. Were there any parameters around the population in terms of their roles? Were these people at certain levels within industry or just general?
I think it's quite a mix, but there were quite a few at sort of who were doctors or consultants. So that's why you're getting the science part of it, but coupled with the altruism as well. So yeah, and power, of course, as well. Yeah. So those were some examples from industry sectors, and I'm sure we can all just intuitively think of different kinds of professions, different kinds of industry sectors and so on that might attract different kinds of value profiles. And then, so this is the second area, looking at career choice in terms of individual profession and trying to find some evidence of, are there specific values profiles in specific jobs? So this one comes from a study. It's just a small hotel management team. It's a study that was done a long, long time ago by Adrian Furnham. And he profiled just a 9-person management team from a luxury hotel group. And they weren't doing very well. And if we look at the values profile, maybe we can see why that was. So they were really high on hedonism. So that pursuit of pleasure, which obviously if you're going to build a luxury hotel, that's what you're doing. People are going to the luxury hotel to have a good time and to have a pleasant time. But contrast that with the very low on commerce. So there wasn't anybody who was kind of valuing, are we actually making any money here? Are we realizing any profit? Personally, I was surprised actually that aesthetics was only average. I thought that might be higher, but maybe that's because for that one, there was more diversity within the group on aesthetics. But the hedonism and the commerce, very, very clear differentiators here. And also I think, yeah, power was very low. So I think that probably had some impact on their relative lack of success. Another area where Hogan have done some research actually was in a call center with sales reps. So this was in a global financial services company. Call center job, sales rep, call center. It's a tedious but demanding job. These people had to take nearly 100 calls per day during their shift. And the company, you won't be surprised to learn, and it's very typical of call centers, typically had a very high turnover rate. And employee engagement surveys showed really low levels of job satisfaction, coupled with the fact that the management tended to set very high expectations in terms of sales performance. They were looking for figures, they were looking for certain metrics to be satisfied, and they pushed hard for those results. So they thought that maybe to improve morale and to try to keep employees a bit longer, to reduce that turnover rate, they should have a look at improving their selection process to align new recruits in terms of their values with the values within the organisation and see if that had some impact. So they did a job analysis, and from the job analysis, they identified 3 critical value scales. So power, affiliation, and altruism. So what you're sort of describing there are employees who are still driven to produce results, perhaps, from the power scale, but they're also good corporate citizens who enjoy interacting with others, the affiliation, and they want to help customers, perhaps, to resolve their issues, coming from the altruism. So what happened was they used these 3 scales as part of the selection process. And when they did that, they found that the turnover rates reduced by 8%. And they were able to give some financial information to translate that into how much money they actually saved, because they actually onboarded 1,000 new employees a year. They estimate that it costs $15,000 to select and onboard each new employee. If they're doing 1,000 a year, that 8% decrease in turnover is reflected in 80 employees retained now. So if you times that by the $15,000, you get this saving of 1.2 million. So that was a process of actually trying to address, well, what are the key values within the organisation? Should we be using that to select people so they might actually fit the process more? Obviously, you've still got a fairly high turnover rate, but you will in any call centre job, but you can see that had quite a major impact for that organisation. Another area in terms of looking at values for an individual profession, Hogan did some research that was published in Talent Quarterly on more than 1,000 HR leaders. So this was just using archival data that they had, but anybody who had the job title of being a CHRO or a Chief People Officer. And from that, they found that the key indicators on values were about having high altruism, high hedonism, and low science. So you can see you've got the concern about the welfare for others and the desire to perhaps contribute to a better society coming from altruism. Also, the desire to enjoy life and to have some fun from the hedonism, but perhaps preferring more intuitive ways of making decisions, not needing everything to be scientific or rational or logical. And this is a personal view, but I wonder if that lower science value actually contributes to some extent to the more sometimes negative impressions of people who are in HR and their credibility and their status within an organisation and how seriously their views are taken. I don't off the top of my head, but I can find it out for you, Tess. I would doubt it, but that's a good point. But so these were the scales that they kind of scored, significantly higher or lower than the general population average on. So these were their markers where they were different to others. But I don't know what their overall commerce score was, but we'll find out for you, Tess. And then organisational impact. How do values apply to business? What impact do they have on business outcomes? So in Bob Hogan's address back in the summer, he gave a couple of really great examples here. So in 2018, AT&T bought Time Warner for an awful lot of money. AT&T is an engineering firm, and Time Warner was an entertainment company. And of course, engineers have a very different approach to life than do people who are interested in films and media and entertainment. And you can see how there would be some kind of values conflict here between those two organizations. And this quote from the New York Times then describes the merging of these two as resulting in a vibrant Time Warner culture of creative energy and success, nurtured over decades, was destroyed within months from that merger process. And in 2022, the deal failed. So an awful lot of money was wasted, and AT&T sold Time Warner. So you can see there critical impact of trying to marry together two institutions, two organizations that just are have completely incompatible values. And another example that Bob Hogan gave is Boeing and General Electric. So obviously, Boeing is a major airplane manufacturer. And for about 20 years, there were two former General Electric executives who were key to having an impact on Boeing. So these people, and I might be pronouncing the name wrong, I don't know, Stone Cipher and McNerney. So they tried to impose their General Electric values on Boeing. So General Electric really focused on profitability, so all those commercial kind of instincts, whereas Boeing was very much about safety and precision, but also innovation. And in that process, the Boeing headquarters got moved from Seattle to Chicago because they wanted to run it like a business, not an engineering firm. And during that time, McNerney, who was one of the GE people, oversaw the building of the new Boeing 737 MAX, which used the old 737 frame to save money. And of course, there were a couple of accidents with those new 737s. And Bob Hogan would argue that Boeing hasn't recovered. So again, huge impact from people just not seeing it eye to eye, not understanding people's core values, the business's core values. But those values, they permeate everything. Boeing needs to be precise. It needs to be safe. Otherwise, disaster is going to strike. It isn't just, values aren't just something that's a kind of nice to have. They have serious outcomes, serious impacts. And within this area, those of us who studied organizational psychology will have come across this model a few times. I certainly studied this model back in the day when I did my MSc, but Bob Hogan still refers to it, and it is a useful model in thinking about how values have an impact on the culture of an organization. So Benjamin Snyder wrote a paper a long time ago called The People Make the Place, in which he described his attraction, selection, attrition model. So he argues that people choose to work in an organization that they perceive to have compatible values with them. If that works out, if they are compatible, they may stay. And if they're incompatible, they will probably leave. So this then starts to build an organization that becomes more homogeneous in terms of its values and therefore in terms of its culture. And that can have positives and negatives. So the positives would be you've got that sort of shared community, a shared sense of understanding, you know what you stand for, people fit in, they feel, it is their place to be there. But it can also perhaps limit certain possibilities. Which I'll refer to actually when we come on to the team evidence. So then finally, Bob Hogan would argue that values drive culture, and that drives engagement within an organization, and that then obviously drives various important and critical organizational outcomes. He argues that the values of senior management drive corporate culture. That then has a massive impact on employee engagement. And there are obviously a number of studies that show high engagement tends to predict all kinds of positive things like lower absenteeism, lower turnover rates, higher productivity, and higher customer service ratings. So again, some serious impacts and influences from values and their impact on culture. But the team impact, and those of us who've worked with teams, I think values are often used as a starting point to work with teams because it's something, values are things we like to discuss. We're happy to discuss our values. Although, actually, when we feel sort of under threat, if we feel challenged, that can make us feel quite uncomfortable. And you can see the outcome of that in some of those failed mergers as well. So I came across this article which I thought was really interesting. Anyway, so it's called High Performing Teams Start with a Culture of Shared Values. And it was published in the Harvard Business Review recently. And I think it's interesting that that word start with. So it isn't the be all and end all. It isn't the only thing that you need. Because these authors talk about the diversity paradox. So diversity is often actually viewed as being in conflict with performance, but actually there's loads of evidence to show that diversity improves performance. So these authors argue you want a team that is diverse enough to be innovative, because homogeneous teams can often perform worse than diverse ones. I'll show some evidence in a moment. But at the same time, you want to balance it with them being cohesive enough to actually be able to work together, because while the benefits of diversity are clear, so are the challenges. We tend to view people who are like in the out group to us as other. So this business of feeling challenged or under threat by people who have opposing values to us, we can feel quite uncomfortable. We can even feel quite tense. And there have been lots of experiments showing how we easily sort of go into our groups and then can, be quite hostile to people who aren't a member of our group. So these tensions, if we don't address them, can then inhibit performance. So it's this interesting balancing act. And a couple of business schools did some research where they put together various groups of college students to solve a murder mystery puzzle. And they found that the ones that were more cohesive, that shared more values, they were much more able to come to consensus. They liked each other, they agreed with each other, and actually felt more confident in their solution, but they were actually more likely to be wrong than the diverse groups. So I love that example. I think it kind of shows exactly. But obviously addressing that and trying to square that circle is a really difficult job. Where are you going to get the balance right? So the authors argue leaders need to be able to try to address that, to build teams that are diverse enough to be innovative, but cohesive enough to work together smoothly. And they argue that the only way to do that is to create an environment where you've got a higher purpose, you've got some shared mission. Yes, you can have some diversity, but you've got to have something that unites people, something that brings people together, that can get them to work together for a common purpose, for a common goal. And they give the example of linking values to performance. Their example would be Steve Jobs at Apple and his commitment to fusing design with technology was a value set that he had that actually attracted both customers and talent. It attracted people to work in the organization. And so one example of an organization that has this really clear overall shared mission, a really strong kind of mission statement, is Patagonia. And bear with me, I might pronounce some of these things wrong because I'm not a climber. So Patagonia, I had thought I'd come across as being a kind of ski wear, but I didn't realize actually that it does all kinds of outdoor clothing, but outdoor equipment. And it all started with climbing equipment. So the guy who started it back in the 60s was a climber, and he was manufacturing pitons. Is that how you say it? Is anybody here a climber? Do you know? Okay, well, I'll just carry on with that one. So these are the things that you hammer into the rock to climb up the rock face. And originally, these pitons were not reusable. And actually, the guy at Patagonia made them in a way where they could be reusable. But it meant that every time you tapped them in and took them out, there was a crack starting to form in the rock. And that would then get wider and wider because as climbers went and followed the same route, they would tap in the same place, and it was damaging the rock face. And what they realized, so this was in America, they were climbing Yosemite, but in Britain, they were using aluminium chocks, which somehow, don't ask me how, but they are applied to the rock face in a way that doesn't damage it, and they are reusable. So they had to question themselves about, well, what were they going to do? Were they going to make this shift? Because they really needed to they did, from an environmental perspective, need to shift to chocks. But from a business perspective, was that going to work? But they did it. And the way that they did it was that they did a load of research on it. They produced a whole manual around it, almost an essay, almost like a manifesto, which they shared with their customers. It became through word of mouth. It became very popular. All expert climbers knew about it. And people within a year, I believe, within the States, had very much shifted from using the pitons to the chocks. And the point here is, and the quote here, is that if it had just been about changing the innovation, being more innovative, then they probably wouldn't have done it. It's just the moral dilemma for the people at Patagonia was so huge for them. They didn't want to be impacting on the environment negatively. They didn't want to be damaging the very rock faces that they were trying to climb. That was why they produced those results in that way, and that they felt that they absolutely had to do it. And as I understand it, that then has been a model that they've adopted going forward. And they speak out to their customers a lot around their concerns around their environmental impacts and improving their social practices. So they feel they've developed a community both within Patagonia, but also amongst their customers. So that's an example of having a really strong overarching mission, but obviously within that, so that unites people within Patagonia, but within that you can have some diversity, but obviously that's not easy to achieve. And then just a couple of other examples in terms of values. I didn't realize this, maybe some of you are writers, but if you look up on Google, how to write a story, most classic storylines are built on values conflicts. Because it's just central to drama. It's central to human drama. Those things that we might struggle with and wrestle with in our lives are often either inner conflicts or conflicts with another person or conflicts with society. And a couple of examples of this would be, so as I say, there's lots of different types of conflict. One is character versus character. So in Les Miserables, you have Jean Valjean, who is sort of the subversive because he's an ex-convict and he's come out, but he is trying to address the injustice that he sees in society for the poor and the downtrodden, and he risks being exposed because he's violating his parole conditions in doing that, so he's wrestling with that, versus Inspector Javert, who is the policeman, who sees everything in black and white. It's got to be done this way. This is the letter of the law. And so he's pursuing Jean Valjean because he's broken the conditions of his parole, but he's not seeing that actually this person is trying to address something greater. It's about a greater good. And similarly, with character versus society, in To Kill a Mockingbird, you have the case, obviously, of Atticus Finch, who's living in a very racist time and in a very racist community. And somebody is accused wrongly, a black man is accused wrongly of raping a white girl. And for Atticus Finch, it's more important to him that he stays true to his own values of what he thinks is right and wrong. And he defends the person even though he's being criticised and getting an awful lot of bother from the society and the people and friends even, people that he knows well. So that's an example, again, of values conflict and how it gets used all the time. And then finally, just a couple of weeks ago, I happened to be reading in my paper an article by Gillian Hyde, and I just thought this was a really nice quote. I thought this was a lovely way of describing values, actually. This was kind of a rallying call to Rishi Sunak to try to get him to up his game prior to the Conservative Party conference and actually speak to people. So his argument is, and I quote, "In politics, as in many aspects of life, your values matter more to voters than your detailed policies. People think in stories," I love that description, "in which your values play a central role. Voters are seeking, or clients or colleagues or whatever, are seeking to understand the values you stand for and the story that tells about you, your party and your country, or your job or your organisation." And he gave a couple of examples, and these are William Hague's words, they're not mine, so whatever your politics are, just bear with me on this. So he contrasted Jeremy Corbyn with Margaret Thatcher in terms of their success rate at being elected. That was the performance outcome that he was looking at. So he argues that one had popular policies, like cancelling student debt and so on, but more extremist values that failed at that time anyway to unite a majority of people behind him and lost an election. Whereas the other had many unpopular policies, but had this sort of overarching clear narrative of, and these are William Hague's words, championing values of self-reliance and economic discipline, which at the time managed to unite a majority of people, and that person was successfully elected 3 times. So in summary, I think I'm hoping that that has kind of reignited perhaps your interest in values as something that we can have a really good and serious conversation with when we have a client's values profile, and really think about the impact that has on their life, on their choices, on the organisation that they work for, how they work with other people, and in terms of their kind of gaining satisfaction from life. So for those of you who don't use the MVPI, hopefully maybe that sparks some interest in using it. And for those of you who do, maybe it's added a bit more flesh to the bones, maybe it's added a few more insights into the kind of information that you can get from it.